Trevor was not an actor to invite argument or controversy on the set. He was the most peaceable of men, I believe, and he liked to get on with his job, to do it as professionally as he could, and let all the minutiae of discussion about where the camera would be set up and all the rest of it, let that be left to the professionals. He knew what he had to do. He was expert at delivering it. And given the right opportunity, the right atmosphere, and a sufficiently challenging role, Trevor was ahead of the game quite easily. But there was one person with whom he did act, who he was still in quite a tizzy about, long after they'd finished working together, and that was Marlon Brando. Now, nobody disputes for a second the impact of Marlon Brando upon 20th century theatre and cinema. It is profound. He almost inaugurated an entire style of acting which persisted from the 50s when he introduced it, right through the 60s, 70s, right up until Brando himself ceased to be a potent force in the cinema. But Brando was a very selfish actor, and Trevor couldn't abide selfishness or posturing. He felt it was completely unnecessary. In fact, not only that, he felt it was an invasion of the rights of other actors. And if anything, Trevor was probably more self-effacing on sets, on film sets and with film crews than almost any other actor you could name. Brando was quite the opposite. Very conscious of self, very assured of presence. And he regarded acting as a battleground, and he had to win. And when he was in a role, even though that role itself transcended all the roles of all the other actors, he would still introduce little tricks, little annoying, irritating little tricks that would confuse or cause the other actor maybe not to give of their best. And of course, as many actors and stars have found in working with Brando, Trevor was in that category. Trevor was one on the making of a film called Mutiny on the Bounty, which they made it together in 1962. Trevor was cast as Captain Bligh, and Brando was Fletcher Christian. It was, in a sense, a rerun of the old Clark Gable, Charles Laughton epic of 1935, made by the same company, MGM. MGM had been very successful in remaking one of its old great epics, Ben-Hur, a year or so before. And with Mutiny on the Bounty, they hoped to, in a sense, recreate the success that Ben-Hur had had. I think it picked up something like 8 Oscars with Mutiny on the Bounty, and so no expense was spared. They wanted Brando in the part, and they were prepared to make concessions. More concessions than really any front office needs to make or should make if it wants equilibrium and a good atmosphere on the set. Because Brando was at heart was a bully. And he had script approval, and he could play the part however he liked. Now, he chose not to follow the characterization of Fletcher Christian in the way it had been written. And he certainly disavowed completely the Clark Gable interpretation. He played Fletcher Christian as a sort of foppish English ne'er-do-well, really. And Trevor couldn't quite understand this, nor could the director, Louis Milestone, who was wanted as far as he could to make this film a true and honest representation of the famous Mutiny on the Bounty story. Brando would have none of this. He scene-stole, almost like a thief. Every time he was on there, he was posturing, he was putting on his funny accent, he was dressing bizarrely, and it was driving Trevor and Richard Harris and the other actors to distraction. Another thing Marlon did, which irritated Trevor greatly, was he extemporized an awful lot. He wrote his own lines and then passed copies of his own lines around to the other actors, but then he didn't keep to them. He would just go off on his own little tangent. And one time when Trevor was late in coming in on the end of one of Brando's speeches, and the director called to him and said, Trevor, you're a bit slow on the uptake there, old son. Trevor said, "Me? talk to Mr. Brando. I will be able to come in on his line if he has the courtesy to let me know when he's going to finish. And that was just another example of, one of many examples of where there was a little bit of antagonism between them. There was another one in which Marlon Brando was required on a particular scene on the beach at Tahiti. Trevor, of course, was all done up there in his famous cocked hat, full uniform, very hot in the sun. Brando was called. He was at that time talking to two Polynesian girls. He seemed to be able to pull Polynesian girls with great ease down in the South Seas. In fact, sidetrack that, he actually bought an island in the South Seas shortly after the filming for himself and his Tahitian lady love. But anyway, Brando was talking to these, and the director called, "Mr. Brando, you're wanted." Brando ignored it, carried on his conversation. Another couple of minutes passed. Trevor, meantime, in the hot sun, sweltering under his hat, his heavy sort of cocked hat that he wore. "Mr. Brando, please, will you come and join us on the set?" called the second unit director. Brando heard, ignored, carried on his conversation as if, and he knew he had all the time in the world. Trevor, meanwhile, was boiling up. And by the time Brando eventually strolled onto the set, Trevor was almost apoplectic with rage and almost ready to faint in the heat. Now, it could be argued, and I'm sure Brando would put this up as his defense, that the antagonism between Fletcher Christian and Bligh towards, at that point in the film, was so pointed that to extract that a better performance from Trevor, it would be good if Trevor was himself feeling that antagonism towards Brando. I think that is probably the method acting's system and technique, whereby you only act out what you're already feeling in real life. It could be argued, possibly, that was Brando's motivation for making the rest of the crew sweat in the hot sun while he carried on his dalliance with a couple of Polynesian beauties. If that's so, well, maybe you can justify it. Trevor certainly never did justify it and never felt that Brando was giving him any ground at all. Despite this, they did work again together in a film in which Trevor had a very small part at the beginning. He was supposed to blackmail Brando into being a double agent for the Allies during the Second World War. And he had a relatively short but supposedly uninterrupted speech right at the beginning of the film. Well, as soon as Trevor walked on the film and started his speech, Brando started his tricks. He started patting a long, big dog. He started putting on crackly gramophone records. He started pouring and mixing tea and making a lot of noise and stirring the tea. Of course, Trevor battled gamely on, delivering his lines with his usual gusto. But fiddling around and doing things and sort of catching the camera's attention and sometimes slumping back in his seat as if he wasn't even listening, although this particular speech should have meant matter of life and death to him. Trevor finished the scene, threw up his hands and said, to his old tricks again, and walked off. And he should have known, of course, but Brando had been very conciliatory, or at least his agent had. It was the same producer as had been on Mutiny on the Bounty, who had assured Trevor that Brando had mended all his old bad ways. But no, a leopard can't change his spots, and Marlon Brando couldn't and wouldn't ever become considerate to his fellow actors.